Good morning, fourth graders. How are you? So I have to first start by apologizing about the confusion for part 15. I guess I didn't make the link public, so many of you had a hard time getting on that link. So rather than submitting a new link for part 16, I just submitted and kept the same link so that we'd be all caught up. So now I'm going on to part 16, right? And let's begin. It's chapter 10. The Starving Time, September 1805. When the Corps of Discovery entered mountain country, Seaman was only one of many four-footed members of the expedition. A small herd of horses trudged along with the explorers. Some of the horses carried riders, others carried baggage. Seaman jogged comfortably along beside the horse's legs, his fur waving and the skin on his back rolling from side to side. The Shoshone horses were used to running with the Indians, and the calm nature of Seaman did not frighten them. Until now, the Missouri River had been a sort of map through the wilderness. But when the explorers entered the Rocky Mountains, there was no clear landmarks to follow. They blundered through dense patches and tangled bushes. Thorny branches snagged the men's buckskin clothes and scratched their faces. They struggled up rocky hills, sides with slopes as steep as the roof of many houses. Sometimes loose stones shifted beneath the horses' feet and they lost their footing. Whenever a horse stumbled, Seaman ran back and urged it on. The explorers followed old Toby, their Shoshone guide, into the rugged landscape. They accepted his directions and trusted his judgment completely. Even the captains were too preoccupied with the difficulty of traveling to worry about the route. Although the men had horses to carry their baggage, and they had left behind the heavy canoes, the land was so rough and the expedition was only covered about 15 miles a day. Yeah, that must have been really, really hard. I always think about them going down the river, but if you had to climb over these huge mountains, oh my goodness. On September 3rd, rain and sleet made the rocky ground slippery. That night, there was a hard freeze. The hunters came in empty-handed except for a few grouse. Reluctantly, the captains ordered the last of the salt pork to be distributed. So they run out of food. "And for the dog?" asked Charbonneau as he passed out supper. "Also a share of pork?" "Of course," Coulter replied quickly. "He earns his share just like the rest of us." Charbonneau looked at Captain Lewis, who nodded. Charbonneau cut a hunk of the meat and tossed it to Seaman. "Chew it slowly, Seaman," Coulter said. "That's not much supper for a big fellow like you." "That's right," York said, washing down some of his meat with a gulp of water. "And this is all the meat that we've got in the pantry." Shannon flopped down beside Seaman and grinned playfully. "You better listen to our advice, Seaman. If you wolf down your supper, you'll have to sit and drool while everybody else is still chewing." He ruffled Seaman's fur. "Of course, I didn't mean to insult you by comparing you to a wolf. Everybody knows wolves have no manners. And wolves, after all, are only distant cousins of more noble dogs, such as a Newfoundland." Shannon glared at Charbonneau. "Why, even among people," he said, "we all have relatives or acquaintances that we're not too proud of." Most of the men chuckled. Seaman paused from his supper and licked Shannon's nose. Shannon wrinkled up his face and made a big show of mopping off the dog's greasy kiss. "Very funny, Monsieur Shannon," Charbonneau grumbled, his face red. "You make the jokes tonight," and all the men laughed at Charbonneau. "But I think you will not be so funny tomorrow. This is the last of our pork, so I think we should all be careful about who gets a share of the meat. Today our hunters were able to find only a few grouse," Charbonneau continued. "And grouse are such skinny birds, they have more feathers than meat. He rolled his eyes in disgust. So tonight you make fun of Charbonneau. Tomorrow you may not be so merry. We are in the middle of the mountains, and we do not know where our next meal will come from. Fortunately, a band of about 400 Indians crossed paths with the Corps the next day. They were on their way to meet their allies, the Shoshones, for the autumn buffalo hunt. Old Toby introduced the Indian chiefs to the captains, who gave out a few medals and small gifts. Although the Indians' food supply was very limited, they shared their small stock of berries and roots. Before they parted company, the Indians also traded some of their horses, increasing the expedition's herd to make them 40 animals. That evening, Seaman received his share of the dried berries and boiled roots, just like the other explorers. Luckily, York had saved the bones from the salt pork, and he boiled these with the roots to add flavor to the scanty meal. Seaman gobbled up his share of the meat-flavored roots and then licked up every dried berry on his pile. After he finished dishing out supper, York finished out the bones and laid them in front of Seaman. There you go, big fellow, York said. Maybe you can scrape off some of that marrow. Be more like the food a dog was meant to eat. Seaman licked York's hand gratefully. He steadied the bones between his paws and gnawed until every crumb of the marrow was gone. It wasn't much, but he went to bed no hungrier than the human explorers. The last of the flour was used up by the 6th of September. Now the expedition's only food stock was a small amount of dried corn and some soup mix. The captain was worried, but old Toby said they were nearing a valley where they could hunt for game. Travel became easier when the explorers entered the Bitterroot Valley. The hunters brought in game. The expedition was able to speed up its pace and cover more than 20 miles a day. After 3 days of travel through the valley, old Toby sat beside Captain Lewis in front of the evening campfire. Seaman watched the Indian's wrinkled face and leathery hands. Old Toby spoke in signs, showing Lewis steep mountains by drawing in the air with his index finger. His expression was very serious as he warned Lewis about the route ahead. Sacagawea sat nearby, nursing Pomp. She listened carefully as old Toby spoke and helped to translate some of his words so Lewis could understand them. The expedition was about to leave the valley, old Toby explained. The route would not take them west, following the Lolo Creek into the high mountains. Lewis nodded. This was the last camp before the explorers faced the most strenuous portion of the route. Old Toby said they should stock up on as much game as the hunters could find. The explorers would also need to gather their courage for an ordeal that lay ahead. The captains named this last camp in the valley Traveler's Rest. The next morning, September 10th, all the hunters went out. That's my birthday. John Coulter whistled for Seaman, his favorite hunting companion. The pair ranged for miles in search of game. Suddenly, Seaman stood still, sniffing and whined. Coulter quickly dismounted, concealing himself and his horse in the shadows and signaling Seaman to join him. 3 Indians were coming towards them. Coulter touched Seaman's nose with his palm of his hand to tell him to sit quietly. He studied the braves, trying to determine whether they were from a friendly tribe. Finally, Coulter snapped a twig to announce his presence. Then he stepped out of the shadows with Seaman by his side. Using signs, Coulter invited the Indians to follow him back to camp. The Indians were the Nez Perce, a tribe that lived west of the Rockies. They drew pictures on the ground to show that they had recently left their village. The braves had just crossed the mountains and were heading east. According to them, it was only a journey of 5 sleeps across the mountain. How the explorers rejoiced! In less than a week, they would be across the mountains. Surely the Corps of Discovery could survive such a short trip, no matter how challenging the conditions. The hunters killed 4 deer today, William, Lewis exclaimed happily as they sat around the campfire that evening. And they brought back a beaver and 3 grouse, too. Even if they can't find any game in the mountain, we ought to be able to manage 5 days' travel on these provisions. not to mention that we have what we have left in our soup mix. Clark added a note of caution. The Indians seem to be able to travel faster than our men, Meriwether. Those braves say it's a 5-day journey, but it may take us longer. The next day, on September 11th, the explorers began to climb out of Bitterroot Valley. On the 13th, they passed a spring that bubbled out of the ground. Mist of steam rose from the water. Seaman reached the spring first. As soon as his paws touched the moist ground, he yelped and jumped backwards, puzzled. The spring's water was boiling hot. York grabbed a pot to collect some of the hot water. He left it to cool briefly, then he stripped off his shirt, splashed his face and chest with the warm water. Grinning, he invited the others to join. "This is the best bath I've had in months," he declared. They proceeded on, crossing Lolo Pass with surprising ease. In the afternoon, Clark rode up to Lewis. "Seems the information we got from the Nez Perce Indians is right on target, Meriwether. We're making marvelous progress. This route is level, open, and firm." Delight sparkled in Clark's eyes. "We should be out of this high country in 4 days." Lewis beamed and his mind raced along the route ahead. "And then we'll find the Columbia River and glide downstream to the Western Sea." We know about the Columbia River, right? On September 14th, it rained and hailed. The men's clothes got soaked and the captain stopped smiling. Seaman shook off the water that was sopping over his coat every few minutes. Then the temperatures dropped and the miserable rain froze. The ground became slippery with ice. To make bad matters worse, it started to snow. Old Toby got confused and led the expedition down the wrong bridge. The hunters came back cold and wet with no game. That evening, the weary explorers had to kill a colt for supper. Old Toby figured out his mistake the next day. By getting back to the trail was very difficult. Fallen trees were scattered all over the steep ground. The horses kept slipping. One horse rolled 40 yards down the mountain until it slammed into a tree. Luckily, the horse survived the tumble without any injuries, but it had been carrying Captain Clark's writing desk, which was shattered. The hunters again returned empty-handed, except for 2 small grouse. York heated snow to make water, adding the grouse and what was left of the colt, and handed out thin meat soup for that evening's meal. Again, he gave Seaman the bones to gnaw. Everybody went to sleep cold, hungry, and discouraged. The snow began to fall 3 hours before dawn on September 16th. When the explorers awoke, they found icy white powder on their faces, hair, and sleeping rolls. The snow continued all day, blanketing the ground in 7 inches of slippery white powder. Snow collected in fluffy little heaps on the branches of the trees, and the men brushed against the branches. Clumps of snow fell on their heads and melted. Icy water slithered down the necks of their shirts. Seaman shook off the snow, but his outer coat got soaked anyway. Snow clumped between the pads of his paws, and he kept stopping to chew out the painful icy balls. That night, Clark complained in his journal, "I've been wet and cold in every part as I ever was in my life. Cold, exhausted, hungry. The men killed a second colt for supper." The explorers had so little food they felt hungry all the time, but they were eating enough to keep themselves alive. Their horses, on the other hand, were starving. All the grasses were dead and buried deep under the snow. On the morning of September 17th, the explorers awoke to Seaman barking. The whole herd of horses was missing. During the night, the animals had strayed all over the countryside in a desperate search for food. The men began rounding the animals up at first light. It took hours. Seaman herded some of the strays by nipping at their heels to drive them back to camp. By the time the horses were collected and packed, much of the daylight had been wasted. Everybody was frustrated. The weather warmed up, but that only made traveling more uncomfortable. The snow melted into ice water and soaked through their moccasins. Well, I'm going to stop there, but wow, in just a couple days, things can really change. We'll see what happens next time. I'll read another chapter tomorrow and see how they get over this pass to the Columbia River. Thanks for listening, everybody.